My wife passed away 2 years ago, leaving me an antique emerald necklace as her final physical memory. Last Thursday, I discovered my wall safe empty because my own daughter sold the heirloom to fund a luxury vacation to Hawaii. When I confronted her, she told me to stop living in the past and go rot in a retirement home. She had no idea that the estate jeweler she sold it to was operating under my late wife's strict secret instructions. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled her entire life while she was sipping cocktails on the beach, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family greed should always be punished with absolute cold justice. I spent 40 years as a civil engineer building bridges that could withstand Category 5 hurricanes. I know how to calculate load-bearing weight. I know how to spot a structural weakness before a collapse. But I completely failed to see the rot inside my own family. My name is William Harding. I am 69 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb outside of Boston. The house is large and empty now. Martha and I bought it 30 years ago. It was the house where we raised our daughter, Stephanie. After Martha lost her battle with cancer, the house became a museum of memories. The most important artifact was kept behind a heavy steel door in my ground floor study. I installed the wall safe myself. It was hidden behind a large framed map of the city. I am a man of routine and precision. Every Thursday morning after making my coffee, I would walk into the study. I would slide the frame to the side. I would turn the heavy brass dial. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The heavy click of the locking mechanism always gave me a sense of security. Inside the safe sat a velvet box. Inside that box was a gold chain holding a flawless teardrop emerald. It was the first substantial piece of jewelry I ever bought for Martha. I saved for 2 years early in my career to afford it. She wore it every anniversary. It smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. It was the only tangible piece of her I had left to hold. Last Thursday, I went into my study with my coffee. The house was completely silent. I slid the framed map aside. My heart stopped. The heavy steel door of the safe was already cracked open. The brass handle hung loose. I did not panic immediately. My trained mind looked for evidence of a break-in. I checked the window locks. They were secure. I checked the study door. No forced entry. I pulled the heavy safe door wide open. The velvet box was gone. My passport was still there. My emergency cash envelopes were untouched. The silver coins were exactly where I left them. Only the necklace was missing. A cold, heavy stone dropped in my stomach. A random burglar does not open a combination safe, leave the cash, and take a single piece of jewelry. A random burglar does not know the combination. Only 3 people in the world knew that sequence of numbers. Me, my late wife Martha, and our daughter Stephanie. Martha gave Stephanie the combination a month before she died, in case of an emergency. I had forgotten she even had it. My vision narrowed. The air in the study felt thin. I picked up my phone and dialed Stephanie. It went straight to voicemail. I dialed my son-in-law Bradley. Voicemail. The silence from their phones was not a coincidence. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. I did not bother finishing my coffee. I drove straight toward their neighborhood. Stephanie and Bradley lived 20 miles away in a gated community built for people who wanted to look richer than they actually were. Their house was a massive modern monstrosity of glass and gray stone. I knew for a fact they could barely afford the mortgage. Bradley ran a boutique marketing firm that was constantly on the edge of bankruptcy. Stephanie refused to work, insisting she needed to manage the household. They leased luxury cars they could not afford and took vacations on credit cards. For the past 2 years, I had quietly paid their property taxes to keep the bank from foreclosing. I endured their condescending attitudes and their constant requests for money because Stephanie was the only family I had left. I thought my financial support bought me at least a shred of respect. I pulled my car into their wide circular driveway. Their leased black luxury SUV had the trunk popped open. I walked up to the massive double front doors. They were unlocked. I pushed my way inside. The house was a chaotic mess of designer clothes and open luggage. House music blared from invisible ceiling speakers. Stephanie was standing in the marble foyer folding a stack of expensive silk dresses into a hard-shell suitcase. She was 32 years old, wearing a designer tracksuit and holding a glass of champagne. Bradley walked out of the kitchen carrying a stack of expensive camera equipment. They looked like they had just won the lottery. Stephanie looked up and froze. Her smile vanished. She set the champagne glass on the console table. She asked me what I was doing there, completely unannounced. I did not waste time with greetings. I did not raise my voice. I asked her exactly one question. I asked her where her mother emerald necklace was. The temperature in the large foyer plummeted. Bradley stopped walking. He looked at Stephanie. Stephanie did not look guilty. She looked annoyed. She crossed her arms and let out a long, dramatic sigh. She told me I was overreacting. She told me to calm down and have a drink. I took a step closer. I asked her again. Stephanie rolled her eyes and picked up her champagne. She looked me right in the eye and confessed without a single ounce of shame. She said she sold it. She said she took it from the safe 2 days ago and brought it to an estate jeweler downtown. I felt the floor drop beneath my feet. I asked her how she could possibly do that to me. I asked her how she could steal the last piece of her mother. Stephanie laughed a sharp, cruel laugh. She told me the necklace was just sitting in a dark metal box gathering dust. She said it was a waste of resources. She claimed she and Bradley had been under immense stress dealing with my depressing grief for the past 2 years. She said they deserved a luxury getaway to Hawaii to reconnect and clear their heads. She used my wife's sacred heirloom to buy first-class plane tickets and a beachfront resort suite. I stood there staring at the woman I raised. I did not recognize her. The sheer entitlement radiating from her face was suffocating. I demanded the name of the jeweler. I told her I was going to buy it back and that I would never forgive her for this. Bradley stepped forward. He stood between me and his wife. He pointed a finger at my chest. He told me to lower my voice in his house. He told me I was acting like a crazy old man. Bradley said Martha was dead and that holding on to old jewelry was pathetic. He told me I needed to stop living in the past. He suggested I sell my large house, give them the equity, and check myself into a retirement home where professionals could deal with my mental decline. He actually smiled when he said it. He called me a burden. The words hit me like physical blows. For years, I had silently absorbed their disrespect. I paid their bills while they mocked my simple lifestyle. I gave them thousands of dollars while they whispered about my age at family dinners. I thought they were just immature. I thought they would eventually grow up and realize the sacrifices I made for them. But looking at Bradley's smug face and Stephanie's cold eyes, the illusion finally shattered. They were not misguided children. They were parasites. They viewed me as nothing more than an ATM machine with a pulse. And now they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They violated my home and sold the memory of the woman I loved to fund their vanity. A heavy horn honked outside. The airport car service had arrived to take them to their flight. Stephanie zipped her suitcase shut. She did not even look at me. She told me to lock the front door on my way out. She said we could talk about my therapy options when they returned from Maui in 2 weeks. Bradley grabbed the heavy bags and walked out the door. Stephanie followed him, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. I did not follow them. I did not beg. I did not yell. I stood alone in their echoing foyer, listening to the engine of the luxury car pull out of the driveway. The deep, suffocating grief that had clouded my mind for 2 years instantly evaporated. It was replaced by something else. A cold, metallic clarity settled over my brain. The civil engineer took over. I saw the structural flaws in their lives. I saw the massive financial cracks they had papered over with my money. They thought they had defeated a weak, grieving old man. They thought I would just sit in my empty house and cry. They were wrong. The father they knew died in that foyer. I walked out of their house and locked the door behind me. I got into my car. The silent adjustment had officially begun. They wanted a vacation. I was going to ensure they had nothing left to return to. I drove straight from that massive, fraudulent house into the heart of downtown Boston. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a terrifying calmness. The betrayal had burned away all the fog in my mind. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic without blinking. I knew exactly where I was going. Stephanie had mentioned the name of the estate jeweler during her arrogant confession. It was a high-end boutique located in the financial district, catering to desperate heirs and wealthy divorcees looking to liquidate their assets quickly. I parked my car in a paid garage 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The crisp city air filled my lungs. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was an engineer who had just identified a critical structural failure, and I was ready to tear the whole building down. The jewelry shop sat on a busy corner with heavy reinforced glass windows displaying antique watches and diamond rings. A discreet brass plaque next to the thick oak door read, "Caldwell Estate Acquisitions." There was no regular handle. I had to press a small illuminated button and wait. A security camera above the door whirred and focused on my face. A moment later, a heavy electronic lock clicked open. I pushed the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The air conditioning was freezing. The air smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. The silence inside was immediate, cutting off the noise of the city streets. A tall security guard in a tailored dark suit stood silently in the corner, watching my every move. A young woman with perfect hair and a fake smile stood behind a long glass display case. She wore white cotton gloves. She looked at my simple jacket and my sensible shoes. I could see the rapid calculation in her eyes, deciding if I was a buyer or someone who was simply lost. I walked directly to her counter. I did not return her smile. I placed my hands flat on the cold glass. I told her I needed to speak to the owner immediately. The young woman blinked, losing her practiced composure. She asked if I had an appointment. I told her I did not need an appointment because her shop had just purchased stolen property and I was here to retrieve it. The fake smile vanished from her face. She took a step back from the counter. She picked up a small black telephone and dialed a single digit. She whispered something into the receiver while keeping her eyes locked on me. A heavy mahogany door at the back of the showroom opened. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s with sharp gray eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a dark blue suit that probably cost more than my first car. He moved with a quiet authority. He walked past the young woman and stood directly across the glass counter from me. He introduced himself as Richard Caldwell. He asked how he could help me. I looked him straight in the eye. I kept my voice completely level. I told him my name was William Harding. I told him that yesterday morning a young woman with blonde hair came into his shop. I described Stephanie perfectly, down to her designer clothes and her arrogant demeanor. I told Richard that she sold him a teardrop emerald necklace set in an antique gold chain. I explained that the necklace belonged to my late wife, Martha, and that it was taken from my private wall safe without my permission. I pulled my checkbook from my inner jacket pocket and slapped it onto the glass counter. I took out my pen. I told Richard Caldwell that I understood he was running a business. I told him I did not care what he paid my daughter for the piece. I was prepared to write a check for double the amount right now. I just wanted my wife's necklace back. I stood there breathing heavily, waiting for him to name his price. I was ready to drain my retirement savings if necessary. That emerald was the only thing I had left of Martha. I braced myself for a difficult negotiation. I expected him to claim he had already sold it to a private buyer. I expected him to demand an extortionate amount of money, knowing my desperation. Richard Caldwell did not look surprised. He did not look defensive. He looked down at my checkbook and then back up at my face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet pouch. He placed it on the glass counter between us. He slowly opened the drawstrings and tipped the pouch forward. The teardrop emerald slid onto the black velvet mat on top of the counter. The green stone caught the overhead lights. My chest tightened. It was exactly as I remembered it. The gold clasp was slightly worn from the years Martha had worn it against her skin. I reached my hand out to touch it. Before my fingers could brush the gold chain, Richard Caldwell placed his own hand over the necklace. He slid it back toward his side of the counter. I felt a surge of pure anger. I demanded to know what he was doing. I told him my checkbook was open and he could name his absolute highest price. I told him I would go to the bank down the street and bring him stacks of cash if he preferred it. I warned him that if he refused to sell it back to me, I would walk straight to the police station and file a formal report for receiving stolen property. Richard Caldwell held up his hand. His expression was completely calm. He picked up my checkbook and slid it back across the glass toward me. He told me to put my money away. He looked me directly in the eyes and said something that completely paralyzed me. He told me he was not going to sell the necklace to me. He said my money was completely useless in his shop. He told me that he had already been paid for this transaction 3 years ago. I stood frozen. The words made absolutely no sense. I asked him what he meant. I told him my daughter only stole the necklace 2 days ago. I told him there was no possible way he was paid 3 years ago for a transaction that just happened. I demanded an explanation. The cold logic of my engineering mind was spinning, trying to solve a problem with missing variables. Richard Caldwell picked up the emerald necklace. He did not look at it like a jeweler appraising a gem. He looked at it like a man holding a very dangerous weapon. He told me that my daughter did not orchestrate this sale. He told me I needed to come back to his private office immediately, because he had something to show me that would change my entire understanding of my own family. I followed Richard Caldwell past the heavy mahogany door. We entered a private office that felt more like a bank vault than a workspace. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling and framed historical certificates. A massive steel safe dominated the far wall. The air in here was even colder than the showroom. Richard walked over to a small crystal decanter sitting on a side table. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to me and motioned for me to sit in one of the leather armchairs opposite his heavy oak desk. I took the glass, but I did not drink. I remained standing. I demanded to know what he meant about being paid 3 years ago. My mind was racing through every possibility, but none of them made logical sense. Martha had been dead for 2 years. Richard sat behind his desk. He took a slow sip from his glass. He folded his hands together and looked at me with a profound sense of respect. He told me that my wife Martha was one of the most intelligent and formidable women he had ever met in his entire career. He said she walked into this very office 3 years ago. It was a raining Tuesday afternoon. She was wearing a beige trench coat and carrying a thick leather binder. Richard remembered the exact date because it was the day she paid him a $20,000 retainer fee in cold, hard cash. The number hit me like a physical blow. $20,000 was a massive amount of money for us. I asked him where she got that kind of money. Richard told me I would find out soon enough. He leaned forward and rested his arms on the desk. He described Martha's condition that day. She looked pale. She looked tired. She told Richard that she had just received a terminal cancer diagnosis from her oncologist. She told him she had roughly 12 months left to live. But Martha did not come to the jeweler to sell her assets to pay for medical treatments. She came to him to lay a trap. Richard looked me in the eyes and delivered the hardest truth I had ever heard. He said Martha knew exactly who our daughter was. She knew Stephanie was completely consumed by greed. She knew that Bradley was a financial parasite draining our accounts. Martha told Richard that I was too blinded by a father love to see the true danger standing right in our living room. She knew that once she was dead, Stephanie would immediately try to strip my life down to the studs. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell Richard he was lying. But the empty safe in my study and the cruel laugh of my daughter in her foyer proved every single word. Martha had seen the structural failure of our family years before I even noticed a crack. I needed to understand the depth of her planning. I asked Richard how she managed to secure $20,000 in cash without me noticing. We shared all our bank accounts. I reviewed our finances every single month. Richard gave a small, knowing smile. He told me Martha had been slowly siphoning small amounts of cash from grocery trips and household expenses for over a decade. She hid the money meticulously. She built a shadow fund entirely out of my sight. She did not do it out of malice. She did it because she understood human nature better than I did. She knew that one day the money would be necessary to fight a war I refused to see coming. He told me about the way she spoke that day in the office. He said her voice never wavered. She did not cry. She was incredibly stoic. She treated the impending betrayal of her daughter like a business problem that required a cold, calculated solution. Richard said he had dealt with thousands of wealthy families over his career. He had seen siblings fight over estates and children manipulate their dying parents. But he had never seen a mother so perfectly anticipate the exact movements of her own child. Martha knew Stephanie was vain. She knew Stephanie was greedy. But most importantly, Martha knew Stephanie was impatient. She knew her daughter would not wait for me to die to start claiming her inheritance. Richard continued his story. He said Martha took the teardrop emerald necklace off her neck and placed it right on this desk. She told Richard that this necklace was the ultimate test. It was the bait. She knew Stephanie coveted the piece. She knew Stephanie would eventually steal it to fund her ridiculous lifestyle. Martha gave Richard extremely specific instructions. She drafted a legally binding contract right there in the office. The contract stipulated that if Stephanie ever walked through the doors of this shop trying to pawn or sell the emerald, Richard was to purchase it immediately. He was to pay Stephanie whatever amount of money she demanded without asking any questions. He was to make her feel like she had won. The $20,000 retainer was the fund Martha set aside to buy back her own jewelry from her own daughter. It was a calculated financial maneuver designed to protect me from the emotional devastation of losing the heirloom permanently. Richard told me that Martha specifically chose his shop because it was the most prominent estate buyer in the city. She knew Stephanie Ego would bring her to the most expensive place in town. I sat down slowly in the leather armchair. The glass of liquor in my hand trembled. I pictured my wife sitting in this exact room. I pictured her carrying the burden of her terminal diagnosis and the betrayal of her only child at the exact same time. She suffered in silence. She spent the last year of her life quietly building a fortress around me while I remained completely oblivious. I felt a wave of profound shame wash over me. I was the engineer. I was supposed to be the protector. Yet my dying wife had to construct a secret defense mechanism to save me from our own flesh and blood. Richard opened the top drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it next to the velvet pouch holding the emerald. He told me that Stephanie walked into the shop exactly as Martha predicted. She came in yesterday morning demanding quick cash for a luxury vacation. Richard said she was incredibly rude to his staff. She demanded $10,000 for the emerald. Richard did not argue. He simply went to the back room, drafted a bill of sale, and handed her the cash from Martha Retainer Fund. He let her walk out the door, thinking she had pulled off the perfect crime. He tapped his finger against the manila envelope. He told me that saving the necklace was only the first part of Martha instructions. The emerald was just the trigger mechanism. Martha told Richard that the day the necklace was sold, was the day I would finally wake up. It was the day the illusion of my family would be shattered forever. And she was right. Today was the day I finally saw Stephanie for the monster she truly was. Richard told me that Martha left something else with him that day. Something far more valuable than a $20,000 retainer or a teardrop emerald. Listening to Richard speak, I felt a profound transformation taking place inside my own mind. The sorrow that had weighed me down since Martha's funeral was completely gone. The lingering guilt I felt over failing my daughter evaporated. If Martha could face her own death and her daughter's betrayal with such cold precision, I had no excuse to be weak. I was no longer a victim of my ungrateful child. I was the executor of my wife's final command. Richard pushed the manila envelope closer to me. He said the instructions were very clear. He was to wait until Stephanie actually sold the piece. He was to secure the emerald in his vault. And then he was to wait for me to walk through his door. He knew I would come looking for it. He knew my meticulous nature would lead me to discover the empty safe within a matter of days. Every single variable in Martha's equation had played out exactly as she calculated. I looked from the envelope to Richard's face. I thanked him for his loyalty to my wife. I thanked him for keeping her secret and executing her plan flawlessly. Richard simply nodded. He said it was an absolute honor to serve a woman of her caliber. He pointed to the emerald still resting in my hand. He told me the time for grieving was over. The trap had been sprung. It was time for me to open my eyes and look at the mechanism she hid inside the jewelry. I stared at the manila envelope resting on the heavy oak desk. I looked back at the velvet pouch and the teardrop emerald sitting beside it. A profound silence filled the vault like office. Richard Caldwell reached across the desk and picked up the necklace. He did not hold it by the gold chain. He pinched the large green stone carefully between his thumb and index finger. I watched his hands. They were the steady hands of a man who had spent decades manipulating microscopic gears and delicate clasps. He walked over to a small wooden cabinet against the wall. He opened a shallow drawer and pulled out a leather roll of specialized jeweler tools. He brought the tools back to the desk and unrolled the leather flat on the polished wood. There were tiny steel screwdrivers and silver tweezers and a specialized magnifying glass with a bright LED light attached to the rim. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. I asked him what he was doing. I told him I had examined that necklace 1,000 times over the past 30 years. I bought it for her. I knew every single scratch on the gold setting. I knew the exact weight of it in my palm. I told Richard there was nothing hidden inside that piece of jewelry because it was a solid stone set in a solid gold backing. Richard turned on the small light attached to his magnifying loupe. He looked at me with a calm expression. He explained that I was absolutely correct about the original design. When I purchased the necklace 3 decades ago, it was a standard antique setting. But he reminded me that Martha brought the piece into this very room 3 years ago. She did not just bring it here to establish a trap for our greedy daughter. She brought it here to be fundamentally altered. Richard told me he employed a master metalworker who specialized in antique restoration and concealed compartments. Martha paid this craftsman $5,000 from her secret cash reserve to hollow out the thick gold backing holding the emerald. She instructed him to build a microscopic hinge and a pressure latch directly into the structural integrity of the pendant. As a civil engineer, I felt a wave of absolute astonishment wash over me. I understood the impossible mathematics required to achieve such a feat. Hollowing out the gold without cracking the pressure set emerald required a level of precision that bordered on surgical. It meant the necklace I had held in my hands after her funeral was actually a mechanical vault. Richard picked up a pair of silver tweezers with needle-fine tips. He held the emerald pendant directly under the bright light. He told me to watch closely. I leaned forward over the desk until my face was only inches away from his hands. He turned the pendant over so the solid gold backing faced the ceiling. To the naked eye, it looked perfectly smooth. It looked like a solid piece of molded metal. But Richard positioned the incredibly sharp tip of the tweezers against a microscopic groove near the top of the setting. It was a groove I had always assumed was just a natural flaw in the antique gold. It was exactly where the metal met the chain loop. Richard applied a very specific amount of downward pressure. He did not pry it open. He pushed the tiny mechanism inward. I heard a sound that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a tiny metallic click. It was the sound of a perfectly machined lock disengaging. Once the internal latch released, Richard carefully pulled the tweezers back. The entire gold backing of the pendant swung open on an invisible hinge. It moved smoothly, without a single sound of friction. The solid gold was actually a hollow shell. Inside the hollowed-out space, resting gently against the rough, unpolished backside of the teardrop emerald, was a small square of dark felt. My hands began to shake. I realized my brilliant wife had walked around for the last year of her life wearing a secret vault right over her heart. She wore it to dinners with our daughter. She wore it while Bradley sat in our living room begging for money. She wore it while she was dying, holding the key to their destruction, right in plain sight. I felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to my eyes. She outsmarted all of them. Richard used the tweezers to carefully lift the small square of dark felt out of the golden shell. He placed the felt on the desk. Hidden beneath the felt was a tiny object wrapped in a thin layer of translucent wax paper. Richard nudged the paper with the tip of his tool. He told me he did not know exactly what was inside the paper. He said Martha packed the compartment herself before the craftsman sealed the pressure latch. His job was simply to build the lock and secure the mechanism. He pushed the necklace and the small wax paper bundle across the polished wood toward me. He told me this part belonged exclusively to me. I reached out with trembling fingers. I picked up the tiny bundle. It was incredibly light. It was no bigger than a postage stamp. I carefully unfolded the brittle wax paper. The paper crackled loudly in the quiet room. Resting in the center of the unfolded paper was a miniature brass key. It was completely flat and incredibly small. It had a complex series of jagged teeth cut into one side and a perfectly round head on the other. It looked exactly like the keys used for high-security deposit boxes. My mind immediately started processing the variables. A key requires a lock. A lock requires a location. I stared at the tiny piece of brass, trying to understand where it belonged. There were hundreds of banks in the Boston metropolitan area. There were thousands of private security vaults. Finding the correct lock without a location would be a mathematical impossibility. I looked up at Richard. I told him a key was useless without a door. I told him there was no identifying information on the brass. Richard smiled a very thin, knowing smile. He reached across the desk and picked up the hollowed-out gold necklace. He held the open golden shell under the bright LED light of his magnifying loupe. He tilted the metal to catch the glare of the bulb. He told me that Martha was far too meticulous to leave a variable to chance. She knew I was an engineer. She knew I required exact data to solve a problem. He told me to look at the inside of the gold backing. He handed me the magnifying loupe. I took the heavy glass instrument and held it to my right eye. I leaned over the desk and brought the golden shell into sharp focus. The inside of the metal flap was not smooth. Scratched directly into the soft gold using a microscopic engraving tool was a sequence of letters and numbers. I read them aloud slowly. First National Bank of Boston. Vault Branch 7. Box 419. The letters were etched with incredible precision. I lowered the magnifying glass. The entire picture suddenly snapped into perfect clarity. Martha had not just hidden a key. She had provided exact coordinates. The manila envelope on the desk contained the instructions for Richard. The necklace contained the key and the map for me. Every single step of this process was a perfectly designed trapdoor, leading me deeper into her master plan. I picked up the small brass key and held it tightly in my palm. The metal felt warm against my skin. The profound sense of grief that had consumed my life for 2 years was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating energy. Stephanie and Bradley were currently flying first class over the Pacific Ocean, laughing about how they had tricked a foolish old man. They had used this exact necklace to fund their arrogant celebration. They had no idea that their greed was the exact catalyst required to trigger their own destruction. Martha had used their predictable selfishness to deliver this key directly into my hands. I looked at Richard Caldwell. I told him I needed to leave immediately. I told him I had a bank to visit before the city branches closed for the evening. Richard nodded slowly. He picked up the empty teardrop emerald and snapped the gold backing shut. The pressure latch clicked perfectly into place, making the necklace look completely normal once again. He slid the necklace into the velvet pouch and handed it to me. He told me to keep it safe. He told me Martha would be very proud of the man sitting in front of him today. I placed the velvet pouch and the tiny brass key deep into my coat pocket. I stood up from the leather chair. I felt taller. I felt stronger. I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors of the jewelry shop and stepped back out into the cold city streets. The trapdoor was wide open, and I was ready to see exactly what my brilliant wife had buried inside that bank vault. I navigated the evening traffic toward the financial district. The First National Bank of Boston stood like a fortress against the fading daylight. I parked my car and walked through the heavy doors just 10 minutes before closing. The lobby was empty. The marble floors echoed under my shoes. I approached the desk and told the teller I needed to access a secure deposit box. I gave her the specific branch and box numbers etched inside the necklace. The teller pressed a button to summon the vault manager. I stood there gripping the tiny brass key. My hands were no longer shaking. My mind was focused on the blueprint my wife left behind. A man in a gray suit arrived and introduced himself. He examined my driver license and compared it to a signature card. He told me Martha had added my name as a secondary authorized user 3 years ago. She had prepared for this exact moment. The manager led me down a short flight of stairs into the basement. We stood in front of the massive circular steel door. He spun a heavy wheel and pulled the door open. We walked into a room lined with thousands of small metal doors. The air was sterile. He guided me down a narrow aisle until we stopped at a section near the bottom row. He pointed to a small metal square stamped with the numbers 419. The manager inserted his master key into the left side of the lock. He stepped back and gestured for me to use my key on the right side. I pulled the tiny piece of brass from my pocket and slid it into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. I turned my wrist and the heavy internal mechanism clicked open. The manager pulled the metal drawer out of the wall and handed it to me. He told me I could use one of the private viewing rooms in the back. He walked out of the vault, leaving me alone. I carried the heavy metal box into a small windowless room, containing only a metal table and a single chair. I set the box down on the cold surface. I lifted the lid. Inside the box, there was no money. There was no jewelry. There was only a thick black leather binder. It looked like an engineering manual. I lifted it out of the box and placed it squarely on the table. I opened the front cover. The very first page contained a handwritten note in blue ink. The handwriting belonged to my wife. She wrote that she was sorry to leave this burden for me to carry alone. She wrote that she loved me too much to let me be destroyed by the people we raised. The note ended with a simple command to turn the page and read the data carefully. I swallowed hard. I turned the page. What I saw completely dismantled my understanding of my own life. The binder was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Martha had spent the last 12 months of her life meticulously auditing our entire financial existence. She had gathered copies of bank statements and tax returns and digital transfer logs. She organized everything with colored tabs. I started turning the pages slowly. My engineering mind immediately recognized the pattern she had laid out. The first section detailed the supposed loans I had given my son-in-law Bradley to support his marketing firm. Bradley had always told me his business was merely suffering from temporary cash flow issues. Martha gathered public records proving his business was a complete failure. It had generated zero revenue for 3 years. He was using my money to pay for his luxury cars. But the business loans were only the beginning. I flipped to the second section of the binder. My heart began to pound, a heavy rhythm. Martha had printed out dozens of digital transfer confirmations from my primary retirement account. These were transfers I had never authorized. For the past 4 years, someone had been quietly siphoning money from my retirement savings in increments of $2,000 or $3,000 at a time. The amounts were small enough to avoid triggering automatic bank fraud alerts, but frequent enough to drain a massive portion of my wealth. Martha had cross-referenced the dates of these unauthorized transfers with credit card statements she had somehow obtained from Stephanie. The correlation was absolute and undeniable. The data painted a clear and terrifying picture. Every time my retirement account mysteriously lost $3,000, Stephanie purchased a new designer handbag or booked a luxury spa. Every time $5,000 vanished, Bradley made a massive payment on their heavily mortgaged house. They were not just asking for my help. They were actively robbing me in the dark. They had forged my digital signature and bypassed my security questions. Stephanie had used the personal information she gathered while supposedly helping me set up my online banking years ago. They had weaponized my trust to execute a systematic embezzlement campaign. Martha had documented every single stolen dollar. She had attached copies of the fake authorization forms. She had built an impenetrable wall of evidence. I sat in that quiet, windowless room for over an hour, absorbing the pure toxicity of their crimes. I read every single page. I studied every forged signature. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the fund I built to protect Martha in her old age. They drained the resources meant to keep us safe. And then yesterday, they had the absolute audacity to stand in their stolen designer clothes and tell me I was a burden. They told me to rot in a retirement home while they used my wife's jewelry to fly to Hawaii. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was staggering. They assumed I would die before I noticed the missing money. They never considered that the mother they dismissed as weak was a master tactician watching their every move. I closed the heavy leather binder. The sound echoed loudly against the concrete walls of the small room. The sorrow that had anchored me for 2 years was permanently gone. The shock of their betrayal was completely erased. All that remained was a cold, unyielding resolve. I did not feel like a grieving father anymore. I felt like an architect preparing to demolish a structurally compromised building. Martha had handed me the absolute perfect weapon. The undeniable evidence in this binder was more than enough to send both Stephanie and Bradley to federal prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. It was enough to legally freeze every single financial asset they currently possessed. They thought they had left me completely broken and defenseless in a lonely, empty house. They thought they had won. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the power to erase their entire comfortable existence. I carefully placed the thick binder into my leather briefcase. I locked the empty metal box and walked out of the room to return it to the vault manager. I walked out of the heavy bank doors and stepped into the dark, cold city streets. The blueprint was complete. The silent execution was finally ready to begin. The sun had barely risen over the Boston skyline when I walked into the glass and steel skyscraper. I did not sleep a single second last night. I spent the entire night sitting at my kitchen table staring at the black leather binder. I memorized every forged signature and every unauthorized bank transfer. I watched the morning light slowly illuminate my empty house, and I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a man preparing for war. My first objective was securing the absolute best legal representation in the city. I did not want a friendly neighborhood attorney who specialized in peaceful mediation. I wanted a corporate predator. I found exactly what I needed in Jonathan Pierce. His law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the building. The reception area was a cold expanse of white marble and black leather. Jonathan Pierce walked out to greet me precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was a man in his late 40s with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected pure intimidation. He did not offer a warm smile or generic condolences about my wife. He simply shook my hand and led me down a long hallway into his corner office. The room smelled of expensive coffee and polished glass. He sat behind a massive transparent desk and gestured for me to take the seat across from him. He asked me why I had requested an emergency meeting before regular business hours. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the heavy black binder. I placed it squarely in the center of his glass desk. I told Jonathan that my late wife, Martha, had compiled this forensic audit during the final months of her life. I explained that my only daughter and her husband had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my retirement accounts for the past 4 years. I told him they forged my digital signatures to fund their luxury cars and their designer vacations. I told him they had stolen my wife's antique emerald necklace 2 days ago and used the money to fly to Hawaii. I leaned forward and told him I wanted to destroy them completely. Jonathan Pierce did not interrupt me. He did not express shock or sympathy. He simply reached out and opened the binder. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of heavy paper. I watched his eyes scan the bank statements and the credit card receipts. I watched him examine the forged digital transfer logs. A slow, predatory smile began to form on his face. When he finally reached the last page, he closed the binder and looked at me. He told me he had reviewed thousands of financial fraud cases in his career, but he had never seen a private citizen build such a flawless chain of evidence. He said Martha had essentially done the job of an entire federal investigation team. He told me the embezzlement case was absolute perfection. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but my mind immediately shifted to the next tactical problem. I told Jonathan that putting them in prison for wire fraud was only one part of the equation. I explained my immediate fear regarding my physical property. I told him how Bradley had stood in my own living room and threatened to liquidate my home. I explained that Bradley wanted to force me into a retirement facility so he could take the equity from my house to save his failing marketing business. I told Jonathan I was terrified that Stephanie might have already forged property transfer documents or secretly taken out a second mortgage on my house using my stolen identity. I asked him how quickly we could place a legal hold on the property deed to prevent them from selling it while they were away. Jonathan stopped tapping his expensive pen against the glass desk. He looked at me with a completely unreadable expression. He folded his hands together and leaned back in his leather chair. He told me I fundamentally misunderstood the current legal status of my own home. He told me Stephanie could not sell the house. He said she could not take out a secret mortgage on it, and she absolutely could not force me to leave under any circumstances. I asked him how he could be so certain of that fact. I told him my name and Martha's name were the only 2 names on the original deed. Jonathan opened a secure biometric drawer on the right side of his desk. He reached inside and pulled out a thick legal document bound in blue, heavy stock paper. It was stamped with a gold notary seal. He slid the document across the glass toward me. He told me I needed to read the cover page. I picked up the heavy document. The title at the top was printed in bold black letters. It read, "The Martha Harding Irrevocable Asset Protection Trust." I stared at the words, trying to comprehend what they meant. Jonathan explained the reality of the situation. He told me that Martha had walked into this exact office 3 years ago, shortly after she received her terminal cancer diagnosis. She brought him the same quiet determination she had taken to the estate jeweler. She hired Jonathan to construct an absolute impenetrable legal fortress around my physical home. He explained that long before she passed away, Martha had legally transferred the ownership of our house out of our personal names and directly into this irrevocable trust. He told me I was listed as the sole lifetime beneficiary. I had the absolute legal right to live in the house until the day I died. But I did not technically own the property anymore, and therefore my daughter could never claim it as a liquid asset. He explained the true brilliance of the irrevocable trust. Because the trust owned the house and not me, it was completely shielded from any outside claims. If Bradley Business went bankrupt, his creditors could never touch my home. If Stephanie tried to declare me mentally incompetent, she would hit a solid brick wall because the trust was managed by an independent corporate trustee selected by Martha. Stephanie had absolutely zero legal authority over the property. She did not own a single brick of it. Jonathan told me that Bradley's threat to sell my house was nothing more than an empty, arrogant fantasy. They had been plotting to steal a castle that belonged to a ghost. I sat in the chair completely stunned by the magnitude of her protection. Martha had anticipated every single angle of their attack. She knew they would come for the money first and the house second. She let them steal the replaceable cash so they would leave a clear paper trail of their crimes, but she permanently locked away the roof over my head. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of awe for the woman I had married. She had fought a silent war against our greedy family, and she had won a decisive victory from beyond the grave. Jonathan leaned forward and tapped his finger against the blue trust document. He told me the defensive phase of Martha's plan was a complete success. My home was safe. My future was secure. He said it was now time to transition to the offensive phase. He told me we were not simply going to hand the embezzlement binder over to the police and wait for a slow trial. He wanted to inflict maximum financial devastation immediately. He opened the binder again and pointed to the section detailing the loans I had given Bradley over the years. Jonathan explained that because Bradley had acquired those business loans under fraudulent pretenses by lying about his company revenue, we had the legal right to instantly call the debts due in full. He told me he was going to draft an emergency injunction this morning. We were going to present the forged documents to a commercial judge and request an immediate total asset freeze on Bradley's entire marketing firm. Jonathan looked me directly in the eyes. His voice was completely devoid of mercy. He told me that by tomorrow afternoon, Bradley business accounts would be locked. His company credit cards would be declined. His payroll would bounce. We were going to suffocate his financial oxygen supply while he was sitting on a beach thousands of miles away. I looked at the shark sitting across from me and I nodded my head. I told him to draft the injunction. I told him to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The legal strategy was locked in and the execution was ready to commence. Jonathan pushed a thick stack of heavy manila folders across the transparent glass desk. They were not standard legal pads or generic court forms. They were the original promissory notes I had signed over the past 4 years to fund Bradley and his failing marketing firm. I looked at the black ink on the bottom line of the top page. Every single time I signed one of those papers, Bradley had sat in my living room looking desperate. He had promised me he just needed a temporary bridge loan to cover his dedicated payroll. He had looked me right in the eyes and lied to my face. Now Jonathan was going to use those exact lies to choke him out completely. Jonathan pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it precisely next to the documents. He explained the mechanism of the trap we were about to spring. He told me that when Bradley secured these personal loans from me, he signed a standard commercial agreement. That agreement stipulated that the funds were to be used strictly for business operations, and that his company was generating a specific amount of verified monthly revenue. Martha had found the actual tax filings for Bradley Business hidden deep inside a shared cloud storage drive. She had printed them and placed them in the black binder. Those tax documents proved Bradley Company had generated absolutely zero legitimate revenue for 3 consecutive years. He had committed textbook commercial fraud by falsifying his financial health to secure my retirement money. Jonathan explained that because Bradley had intentionally breached the core covenants of the loan agreements, we did not have to wait for a missed payment to take action. We had the absolute legal authority to declare the entire debt immediately due and payable in full. Jonathan tapped the first document with his index finger. He called it a notice of default and demand for payment. He told me that by signing this single page, I would legally demand the immediate repayment of over $300,000. He knew Bradley did not have $300,000 in his accounts. Bradley had spent it all on leased luxury vehicles and expensive dinners to project an image of success he never actually earned. But the demand for payment was only the bait for a much larger trap. Jonathan pushed a second document forward. It was an emergency ex parte motion for prejudgment attachment. The legal terminology sounded complicated, but Jonathan translated it into brutal reality for me. He explained that because we had absolute documentary proof of Bradley financial fraud, we were completely bypassing the standard slow litigation process. We were going directly to a commercial judge this morning to request a total aggressive asset freeze. Jonathan described exactly what would happen the moment the judge signed the court order. The court would immediately transmit a legally binding mandate to every major banking institution in the state of Massachusetts. By tomorrow afternoon, the electronic locks would snap shut on every single account tied to Bradley's name or his corporate tax identity. His corporate checking account would be frozen solid. His payroll processing system would be completely disabled. The high-limit credit cards he was currently using to buy expensive cocktails on a beach in Hawaii would be instantly declined at the register. I picked up the silver fountain pen. The metal was cold against my fingers. I thought about the day Bradley stood in my foyer and called me a burden. I thought about him telling me to sell my home and check myself into a nursing facility while he packed his designer luggage. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation or fatherly guilt. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the notice of default. My signature was sharp and perfectly legible. I moved to the next document. I signed the ex parte motion. I signed the sworn affidavits Martha had prepared. I signed every single piece of paper Jonathan placed in front of me without a second thought. With each deliberate stroke of the pen, I was systematically destroying the fake empire my son-in-law had built with my stolen money. Jonathan gathered the signed documents and placed them carefully into a thick leather portfolio. He looked at his heavy silver wristwatch. He told me the commercial courts opened in exactly 1 hour. He said he had a personal working relationship with a judge who absolutely despised financial predators who targeted the elderly. He promised me the asset freeze would be active and circulating through the banking system before the sun set today. But Bradley was only half of the problem. I looked at Jonathan and asked him about Stephanie. I asked him about the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had directly embezzled from my personal retirement accounts, using forged digital signatures. I wanted her to feel the exact same level of absolute devastation. I wanted her to pay for stealing her mother's antique emerald necklace. Jonathan leaned back in his heavy leather chair and smiled a cold, calculated smile. He told me we had to sequence our attacks perfectly to inflict maximum psychological and financial damage. He explained that if we went to the police today and filed criminal charges for wire fraud, Stephanie might get tipped off by the authorities. She might panic and try to hide whatever liquid cash she had left in offshore accounts or untraceable cryptocurrency. She might even try to flee the jurisdiction and stay hidden in another country. He told me the most effective strategy was to let the civil financial trap snap shut first. He wanted Bradley business to collapse immediately. He wanted their credit cards to decline while they were out at an expensive restaurant. He wanted them to feel the sheer rising panic of having absolutely zero access to capital while they were trapped thousands of miles away from home. He wanted them to burn through their remaining pocket cash just trying to survive the remainder of their ruined luxury vacation. Jonathan opened the black binder and pulled out the section containing Stephanie forged bank transfers. He told me he was going to draft a comprehensive criminal complaint detailing her elder financial abuse and felony wire fraud. He was going to package the complaint with the absolute forensic proof Martha had gathered. But he was not going to submit it to the district attorney today. He was going to hold it like a loaded weapon. He explained that we were going to let them return from Hawaii. We were going to let them walk off that airplane completely broke, exhausted, and furious. We were going to let them discover that their leased cars had been repossessed at the airport parking lot because the automatic payments bounced from their frozen checking accounts. We were going to let them spend their last few dollars on a miserable taxi ride back to their massive, heavily mortgaged house. And when they finally arrived home feeling completely defeated and confused, that was when we would drop the final massive anvil on their heads. Jonathan told me he would personally deliver the criminal complaint to the authorities the exact moment their flight landed in Boston. By the time they figured out their financial lives were permanently over. The police would already be finalizing the arrest warrants for multiple felony charges. It was a masterclass in psychological and financial warfare. Jonathan was not just taking my stolen money back. He was ensuring they would never have the resources to fight me in court. They would have no money to hire a competent defense attorney. They would have no liquid assets to leverage for a bail bond. They would be entirely at my absolute mercy. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I felt a massive surge of energy rushing through my veins. The civil engineer inside me recognized the absolute structural perfection of this legal blueprint. Every single support column holding up their arrogant lives had been rigged with explosives. I shook Jonathan's hand. His grip was firm and completely confident. He told me to go home and wait for his phone call. He told me the demolition was officially about to begin. I walked out of his corner office and took the elevator down to the marble lobby. I stepped out into the busy Boston streets. The morning commute was in full swing. People were rushing to their jobs, completely unaware of the massive unseen forces moving around them. I walked toward my parked car, feeling lighter than I had in 2 entire years. I had walked into that office building as a victim of my own family. I was walking out as the architect of their total ruin. The trap was set perfectly. The mechanism was armed. All I had to do now was sit back and watch them pull the trigger themselves. 5,000 miles away from the cold reality of Boston, the tropical sun was beating down on the pristine white sand of a private beach in Maui. Stephanie was lounging under a rented cabana that cost $800 a day. She was wearing a new designer swimsuit she had purchased with the exact funds she drained from my retirement account just last month. Bradley was at the resort bar ordering their 4th round of expensive artisan cocktails. Life was perfect in their stolen paradise. They were celebrating their own arrogance. The waiter arrived at their cabana carrying a silver tray with their drinks and a small black leather checkbook. Bradley casually pulled his platinum corporate card from his expensive leather wallet and dropped it onto the tray. He did not even bother to look at the total. He expected the transaction to be completely seamless, just like every other transaction he had fraudulently funded over the past 3 years. The waiter smiled politely and walked away toward the resort payment terminal. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. The polite smile was completely gone. He leaned down and whispered quietly to Bradley that the corporate card had been declined. Bradley let out an arrogant laugh. He told the waiter it was an obvious bank error and pulled out his personal premium credit card. He tossed it onto the silver tray with a dismissive wave of his hand. 3 minutes later, the waiter returned again. His face was completely flat and professional. He informed Bradley that the second card was also rejected by the issuing bank. Stephanie sighed loudly in sheer annoyance. She sat up from her lounge chair and reached into her expensive woven beach bag. She pulled out her own high-limit credit card. She handed it to the waiter and told him to just run it and stop bothering them so they could enjoy their vacation. When the waiter came back for the third time, he was not alone. The resort manager was walking right beside him. The manager politely but firmly informed them that every single financial instrument they presented had triggered a hard freeze from their respective banks. They were completely cut off. Back in Boston, I was sitting calmly at my kitchen table watching the rain streak down the glass of my sliding doors. My cell phone began to vibrate violently against the wood. The caller identification displayed the name of my daughter. I let it ring 3 times. I took a deep breath and let the civil engineer take over my mind. I answered the phone and put it on speaker. I did not say hello, I just listened. Stephanie's voice exploded through the speaker. She was practically screaming over the sound of ocean waves in the background. She demanded to know what was going on with their bank accounts. She yelled that they were standing in the lobby of a luxury resort being treated like absolute criminals by the hotel management. She told me every single card they owned was declining, and they had absolutely no cash left to pay their massive room tab. She actually had the audacity to blame me for her humiliation. She accused me of forgetting to deposit the monthly property tax check into their joint account, which she claimed must have triggered an overdraft. She commanded me to drive to my local bank branch immediately and wire $10,000 directly to the resort front desk. She said she was too stressed to deal with this financial incompetence, and that I needed to fix it right now. I sat in my quiet kitchen listening to her entitled rage. 2 days ago, that tone of voice would have caused me immense anxiety. I would have rushed to the bank to solve her problems just to keep the peace. I would have apologized for something I did not even do. Today, her panic sounded like beautiful music. I leaned toward the phone and activated the absolute perfect disguise. I played the confused, grieving old man she always believed me to be. I made my voice sound incredibly weak and unsteady. I stammered slightly. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. I told her my memory had been foggy lately, and I could not remember anything about a property tax check. I suggested that maybe her bank flagged her cards for international fraud because she was traveling outside of her normal area. I told her I could not possibly figure out how to wire money to a resort in Hawaii because the computer systems were just too complicated for an old man like me to understand. Stephanie let out a furious scream of frustration that echoed through my quiet house. She called me absolutely useless. She told me I was a burden and that I could not do a single thing right. She commanded me to just call my bank and read them her account numbers so they could force a transfer. I kept my voice trembling and pathetic. I told her I would try my best, but my joints were aching badly today, and I might need to take a nap before I could drive in the rain. I told her I was very sorry she was having a bad time on her trip. Stephanie screamed one final insult. She slammed the phone down so hard, the line disconnected with a sharp, loud crack. The silence returned to my kitchen. The moment the call dropped, the weakness entirely vanished from my posture. I sat up perfectly straight. My hands were completely steady. I reached across the kitchen table and picked up my home telephone. I dialed the direct office line for Jonathan Pierce. He answered on the very first ring. I told him the financial trap had officially snapped shut on the island of Maui. I described Stephanie's furious phone call and the absolute panic in her voice. I confirmed that they were currently stranded in a luxury resort with zero access to capital. Jonathan chuckled darkly on the other end of the line. He told me the commercial judge had moved much faster than expected. The prejudgment attachment was already ripping through the financial system, locking every digital door it could find. He said Bradley business accounts were now completely frozen, and the bank had automatically locked all associated personal credit lines to prevent further liability. I asked Jonathan if he was ready for the next phase of the demolition. He confirmed he was sitting at his heavy glass desk with the completed criminal complaint resting right in front of him. He had the forensic binder prepared. He had the forged digital signatures highlighted and cross-referenced with the unauthorized bank transfers. I gave him the absolute green light. I told him there was no reason to wait any longer. I authorized him to transmit the entire package directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the District Attorney Office. I wanted the formal charges of elder abuse and felony wire fraud filed immediately. Jonathan agreed. He told me the police would begin their investigation today. By the time Stephanie and Bradley managed to beg or borrow enough monies to coach ticket back to Boston, the arrest warrants would be drafted and waiting. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The storm was finally breaking. I had successfully weaponized their own greed against them. They were entirely trapped in a cage of their own making. And the best part was they still believed I was just a helpless old man sitting alone in the dark. They had absolutely no idea the executioner was already sharpening the blade. I pulled my car into the wide circular driveway of their massive modern house at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. I was not alone. Behind me, a massive white moving truck rumbled up the paved incline. Beside it was a small white van belonging to a commercial locksmith. I stepped out of my car into the crisp morning air. I held a thick manila envelope containing the executed court orders. The legal mandate gave me absolute physical possession of the property. When Bradley signed those fraudulent business loans, he had used the equity in this house as collateral. Now that the loans were in total default, the house legally belonged to me. I was not breaking the law. I was simply collecting my collateral. I walked up to the heavy double front doors and handed the court order to the locksmith. He read the judge's signature, nodded his head, and pulled a heavy metal drill from his tool belt. The high-pitched whine of the drill biting into the expensive brass lock echoed through the quiet, gated community. It was the sound of their fake reality being permanently dismantled. Within 5 minutes, the heavy doors swung open. The locksmith removed the internal mechanisms and replaced them with heavy-duty industrial deadbolts. He handed me the 3 new silver keys. I put them in my pocket. The original keys Stephanie and Bradley carried with them in Hawaii were now entirely useless pieces of metal. I turned to the foreman of the moving crew. He was a large man with a serious expression. I handed him a map of the house and a very specific set of instructions. I told him I wanted every single personal item boxed and removed from the premises. I did not want a single piece of clothing, a single photograph, or a single toothbrush left behind. I wanted the house stripped down to the bare walls and the heavy furniture. The foreman blew a sharp whistle, and 6 men marched into the foyer, carrying stacks of heavy cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape. I stood in the center of the marble foyer and watched the absolute destruction of their vanity. This was the exact spot where Stephanie had stood drinking champagne and laughing at my grief just a few days ago. Now strangers with heavy work boots were walking across her pristine floors. I directed the men into the kitchen first. I watched them empty the massive stainless steel refrigerator. They threw away the expensive imported cheeses and the organic vegetables. They packed the crystal wine glasses and the silver flatware into tightly wrapped boxes. There was no care for the sentimental value of these items because these items were purchased with stolen money. Every single plate and glass represented a forged digital signature on my retirement account. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase to the master bedroom. The room was a monument to their arrogance. The massive walk-in closet was filled with rows of designer shoes and silk dresses. Stephanie had funded this entire wardrobe by draining the funds meant for my old age. I remembered reading Martha Auditbinder and seeing the exact dates the money vanished, correlating perfectly with the release of these designer collections. I watched the movers rip the expensive clothes off the velvet hangers and stuff them into large wardrobe boxes. They did not fold them neatly. They treated the designer labels like cheap rags. On the other side of the closet, the men packed Bradley expensive custom-tailored suits and his collection of luxury watches. They gathered the expensive camera equipment he had been holding in the kitchen and stacked it carelessly into a plastic bin. The methodical packing continued for 6 straight hours. The sound of ripping packing tape echoed off the bare walls. Every time a box was sealed, the moving crew carried it out the front door and loaded it into the belly of the massive white truck. The house slowly transformed from a luxury estate into an empty, echoing cavern. All the visual proof of their fake wealth was systematically erased. The designer rugs were rolled up. The expensive modern art was pulled off the walls, leaving behind empty square shadows on the paint. I walked from room to room, ensuring absolutely nothing was missed. I wanted them to return to a shell. I wanted them to see exactly what their lives amounted to without my stolen money funding their illusions. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the job was completely finished. The inside of the house was entirely hollow. The moving foreman handed me a digital tablet containing an itemized inventory of 214 sealed boxes. I signed the screen to confirm the load. I got back into my car and followed the heavy white truck out of the gated community. We drove 15 miles away from their wealthy neighborhood to an industrial park on the edge of the city. I had rented a large commercial storage unit. It was not a climate-controlled facility. It was a concrete box with a rolling steel door surrounded by a chain-link fence. I watched the men unload the boxes and stack them high against the bare concrete walls. The designer clothes, the expensive electronics, the crystal glasses were all piled into this cold, dark space. The physical representation of their stolen wealth looked absolutely pathetic sitting on a dirty warehouse floor. When the truck was finally empty, the foreman rolled the heavy steel door down to the ground. The metal crashed loudly against the concrete. I walked over to the office manager and paid for exactly 1 month of rental fees in cash. I did not leave a credit card on file. I did not set up automatic payments. In 30 days, if Stephanie and Bradley could not find a way to pay the storage bill, the facility would auction off everything they owned to the highest bidder. I took the cheap brass key for the storage padlock and slipped it into my pocket right next to the new keys for their house. I drove back to the empty property one final time. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. The massive modern house looked completely dead. The windows were dark. The driveway was empty. I walked up to the heavy double front doors. I pulled a thick roll of industrial tape and a heavy plastic sleeve from my briefcase. Inside the sleeve was a formal legal notice of foreclosure and eviction signed by the commercial judge. I taped the notice directly at eye level on the glass panels of the front door. The bright yellow paper stood out violently against the dark wood. It was an undeniable declaration of their total financial ruin. But I knew Stephanie and Bradley were incredibly arrogant. I knew they might try to break a window or smash the new locks to force their way inside when they finally returned. They still believed they were entitled to whatever they wanted. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a massive hardened steel padlock and a thick iron chain. I wrapped the heavy chain through the large decorative brass handles on the exterior of the double doors. I pulled the chain tight so the doors could not be forced open even a fraction of an inch. I snapped the heavy padlock closed. The thick metal click resonated in the quiet evening air. I stood back and examined my work. The physical execution was flawless. They had left this house laughing at a weak old man. They were going to return to a fortress locked entirely against them. Every single dollar they had stolen, every single lie they had told, had led them directly to this locked door. They had absolutely no money. They had absolutely no credit. They had no cars waiting for them at the airport. And now they had absolutely nowhere to live. I walked back to my car and started the engine. I drove away from the property without looking back in the rearview mirror. The stage was perfectly set for their devastating return. I drove back to my own home to wait for the final act of this tragedy to unfold. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, parked quietly, under the thick canopy of a large oak tree 2 blocks away from their house. The sun had completely set, leaving the affluent neighborhood bathed in the cold, artificial glow of street lamps. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. According to the flight tracking application on my phone, their plane had landed at Logan International Airport exactly 2 hours ago. I knew exactly what they had been doing for those 2 hours. I knew the precise sequence of their humiliation. When they walked out of the airport terminal, dragging their heavy designer suitcases, they expected to find their leased luxury vehicles waiting for them in the premium long-term parking garage. They expected to load their bags into the plush leather interiors and drive home in absolute comfort. Instead, they found 2 empty parking spaces. Jonathan had assured me that the commercial banks moved with ruthless efficiency when a total asset freeze was executed. The automatic lease payments had bounced 3 days ago. The banks had immediately tracked the GPS signals of the luxury cars and dispatched recovery agents to repossess them right out of the airport lot. Stephanie and Bradley had stood in the cold parking garage completely stranded, with absolutely no access to credit, and only a few crumpled dollar bills left in their pockets. I watched the entrance of their street through the darkness. A pair of faded headlights turned the corner. It was a battered yellow city taxi. The vehicle rattled loudly as it drove up the pristine suburban road. It was the ultimate visual downgrade from their fake billionaire lifestyle. The taxi slowed down and pulled into the wide, circular driveway of the massive gray stone house. The house was completely dark. The automatic porch lights they usually kept burning all night were turned off because the utility companies had already severed the accounts. The taxi engine idled loudly. I watched through my windshield as the rear doors opened. Bradley stepped out first. He was wearing an expensive linen resort shirt that looked completely ridiculous in the cold Boston night. He looked exhausted. His posture was slumped. He walked to the driver window and argued with the cab driver for a solid minute. He was undoubtedly scraping together his last remaining cash to pay the massive meter fare from the airport. Stephanie climbed out of the other side of the cab. She was shivering. She wrapped her arms around herself and glared at the dark house. The cab driver popped the trunk. Bradley had to heave the heavy hard-shell suitcases out onto the cold driveway by himself. The taxi driver did not help him. The yellow cab immediately reversed out of the driveway and sped away down the street, leaving them entirely alone in the suffocating silence. They stood on the pavement for a long moment. They were surrounded by their expensive luggage, but they had absolutely nothing else. I watched them grab the handles of their suitcases and begin the long walk up the driveway toward the grand double doors. The plastic wheels of their luggage echoed loudly against the asphalt. Stephanie was walking a few steps ahead of Bradley. She was clearly furious about the repossessed cars and the miserable taxi ride. She marched up the front steps and stopped in front of the massive wooden doors. Even from my vantage point down the street, I could see the exact moment the confusion set in. Stephanie reached for the heavy brass door handle. Her hand stopped in midair. She leaned forward, peering into the darkness. She turned around and yelled something at Bradley. Her voice carried thinly through the cold night air. Bradley rushed up the steps, leaving the heavy bags at the bottom. He pulled his own keychain from his pocket and thrust his house key into the lock. He twisted his wrist forcefully. The lock did not turn. He pulled the key out and tried again, violently shaking the handle. The heavy industrial deadbolts the locksmith had installed were completely unyielding. Bradley took a step back and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He stared at the dark screen. His phone was dead. Even if it had a charge, his cellular service had been suspended that morning due to non-payment. He was completely cut off from the outside world. Stephanie pointed a shaking finger at the glass panel on the right side of the door. From where I was sitting, I knew exactly what she was pointing at. It was the bright yellow notice of foreclosure and eviction I had taped directly at eye level. Bradley leaned close to the glass and read the legal document. I could almost feel the exact second the air left his lungs. He reached out and touched the paper as if verifying it was real. He read the signature of the commercial judge. He read the clause stating that the property had been legally seized to satisfy his massive defaulted business loans. He turned his head and looked at the center of the double doors. He finally noticed the thick iron chain wrapped tightly around the decorative handles. He reached out and grabbed the heavy, hardened steel padlock. He pulled on it with all his remaining strength. The chain rattled aggressively against the wood, but it held completely firm. Stephanie pushed past him. She pressed her face directly against the cold glass panel next to the yellow notice. She cupped her hands around her eyes to block out the street glare and looked deep into the dark foyer. She was expecting to see her expensive marble console table. She was expecting to see her massive crystal chandelier. She was expecting to see the life she had built using the money she stole from my retirement account. Instead, she saw absolute emptiness. She backed away from the window, stumbling down the first stone step. She covered her mouth with both hands. Her expensive designer beach bag slipped off her shoulder and hit the concrete. Bradley rushed to the window and looked inside. He pressed his entire body against the glass. The realization crashed down on them with the weight of a collapsing building. The house was not just locked. It was completely hollowed out. Every single piece of furniture, every single item of clothing, every single trace of their existence had been entirely erased. They were standing in the cold, wearing lightweight vacation clothes, staring at a fortress they could no longer enter. They had no cars. They had no money. They had no home. The massive structure of lies they had built over the past 4 years had been systematically demolished while they were sipping cocktails on a beach. I watched Bradley drop to his knees on the front porch. He grabbed his hair with both hands. The arrogant man who had stood in my living room and told me to check myself into a retirement facility was now completely broken, crying on the front steps of a house he no longer owned. Stephanie began to pace back and forth across the front porch. She was waving her arms frantically. She was looking around the dark neighborhood, hoping one of her wealthy neighbors would come outside and offer them sanctuary. But the neighborhood remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to associate with a screaming woman locked out of a foreclosed home. She walked down the steps and stood next to her pile of designer luggage. She looked absolutely pathetic. The woman who had sold her dead mother emerald necklace to fund a luxury vacation was now homeless, standing in the cold, with absolutely nowhere to go. I put my car into gear. I did not turn on my headlights immediately. I slowly rolled down the quiet street, leaving the shadows of the oak tree behind. I drove past their driveway. I did not stop. I did not roll down my window to gloat. I simply looked at them through the passenger side glass. Stephanie looked up as my car passed by. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met in the dark. I saw the absolute terror in her face. I saw the moment she recognized my vehicle. I saw the exact moment she realized the foolish, grieving old man had been the one to orchestrate her total destruction. I kept driving. The first phase of their return was complete. The psychological devastation was absolute. Now they had no choice but to come to me. I pressed my foot on the accelerator and headed back to my own home where the lawyer and the jeweler were already waiting. I sat at the head of my long mahogany dining table. The house was perfectly silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I had left the front porch light burning brightly against the dark night. It was a beacon drawing the desperate insects directly into the trap. To my right sat Jonathan Pierce. He looked incredibly comfortable in my home, wearing a dark tailored suit and holding a thick leather portfolio resting on the polished wood. To my left sat Richard Caldwell. He wore a quiet expression of absolute solidarity. Resting precisely in the center of the table between the three of us was the black velvet pouch containing my wife's teardrop emerald necklace. Next to it sat the massive forensic audit binder. We did not speak, we did not need to. The preparation was entirely complete. Every legal document was signed. Every financial door was locked tight. Every criminal charge was drafted and waiting for my final command. I poured 3 glasses of water and set them on the table. We were simply waiting for the inevitable arrival of the two most arrogant people in the city. I knew they were coming because they had absolutely no other option left in the world. Their house was padlocked and chained. Their bank accounts were frozen solid by court order. Their premium credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. They had no friends who would take them in at this hour because their entire social circle was built entirely on the fake wealth they projected. Their wealthy neighbors would never open their doors to a screaming couple dragging suitcases across a foreclosed driveway. I knew they would be forced to make the journey to my house. It was a 20-mile distance from their gated community to my quiet suburb. They had no money to hire another taxi after the airport ride drained their cash. They had no luxury vehicles waiting for them. They were forced to walk to a public transit station, dragging their heavy hard-shell luggage over miles of cold, unforgiving pavement. I pictured them sitting on a dirty late-night commuter train, shivering in their thin, tropical vacation clothes. They were surrounded by the harsh reality they thought they had permanently escaped. I knew every single step of that agonizing journey would only fuel their entitled rage. They would blame the transit system. They would blame the banks. They would blame the taxi driver. But most of all, they would blame me. By the time they reached my neighborhood, they would be completely exhausted physically, but absolutely furious mentally. They would be ready to kick my front door down and demand that I fix the massive inconvenience I had somehow caused them. They still believed they held the ultimate power in our relationship. They still believed I was the weak foundation they could stomp on to rebuild their comfortable lives. The grandfather clock chimed midnight. The deep, heavy sound reverberated through the quiet rooms of my house. A few minutes later, I heard the loud, aggressive sound of plastic wheels dragging across the concrete of my driveway. The noise was chaotic and completely shattered the peaceful silence of my property. I did not move from my heavy wooden chair. Jonathan slowly unclasped the leather strap of his portfolio with a quiet snap. Richard placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and took a deep breath. I listened to the heavy footsteps stomping up my wooden porch stairs. They did not ring the doorbell. They did not knock politely to announce their arrival. Stephanie began pounding her fists violently against the thick wood of my front door. The entire house shook with the sheer force of her anger. I heard Bradley yelling my name through the solid wood. His voice was completely ragged and desperate from the long, cold walk. He commanded me to open the door immediately. He yelled that he knew I was awake and that he was going to break the glass panels if I did not let them inside out of the cold. He was trying to project his usual physical dominance, but underneath the aggressive shouting, I could hear the absolute rising panic of a man who finally realized he was completely drowning. I stood up from the dining table. My movements were slow and deliberate. I walked down the long hallway toward the front entrance. The violent pounding continued relentlessly against the wood. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. I pulled the front door open. Stephanie and Bradley practically fell into my foyer. They looked absolutely horrendous. Their expensive resort clothes were stained with dirt and heavily wrinkled. Their faces were pale and drawn from the cold wind and the sheer stress of their fake reality collapsing around them. Stephanie's blonde hair was a tangled, messy knot. She immediately pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. She did not ask me if I was okay. She did not tell me a single detail about her tropical trip. She immediately launched into a screaming tirade that echoed off the high ceiling. She demanded to know what I had done to their house. She yelled that there was an industrial padlock on her front door and that all her expensive belongings were completely missing. She accused me of forgetting to pay the property taxes again and causing a massive bank error that ruined her entire life. She commanded me to go get my wallet and give her my premium credit cards right now so they could go check into a luxury hotel downtown. She told me I was going to pay dearly for the terrible emotional trauma I had caused her tonight. Bradley stepped forward aggressively, trying to physically intimidate me just like he did a few days ago. He puffed out his chest and told me he was going to hire a ruthless lawyer and sue me for gross negligence. He yelled that my financial incompetence had caused his vital business accounts to freeze and his expensive cars to be towed by repo agents. He demanded that I go to the local bank branch first thing in the morning and liquidate my entire retirement account to fix the massive financial mess I had created. He told me I owed them massive compensation for the absolute nightmare they just endured. I did not interrupt their screaming. I did not back away from his aggressive posture. I simply stood motionless in the foyer and let them exhaust the very last remaining drops of their toxic entitlement. I watched their chests heave as they desperately tried to breathe. When they finally stopped yelling, the foyer descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at both of them with an expression of absolute cold indifference. I did not raise my voice to match theirs. I simply turned around and told them to follow me into the dining room. I walked slowly down the hallway. I heard them dragging their heavy suitcases inside and slamming the front door shut behind them. They followed me, completely unaware of the massive trap they were walking directly into. I stepped into the dining room and walked back to my chair at the head of the table. Stephanie and Bradley marched into the room right behind me, ready to continue their ridiculous demands. They stopped dead in their tracks. The loud plastic wheels of their luggage halted instantly. The anger completely drained from their faces, entirely replaced by absolute, profound shock. They stared at Jonathan Pierce sitting in his sharp, expensive suit, looking at them like a corporate predator observing its trapped prey. They stared at Richard Caldwell sitting quietly with a look of absolute disgust on his face. And then their eyes fell onto the center of the heavy mahogany table. Stephanie's breath hitched loudly in her throat. She saw the black velvet pouch. She saw the familiar gold chain and the flawless teardrop emerald resting perfectly under the bright dining room chandelier. It was the exact same necklace she had sold to a downtown jeweler just a few days ago to fund her tropical vacation. Her eyes darted from the green stone directly to Richard Caldwell's face. She recognized the jeweler immediately. The arrogant confidence she had carried into my house completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. She took a panicked step backward and bumped hard into Bradley. Bradley was not looking at the jeweler. He was staring directly at the thick black leather binder sitting next to the necklace. He saw the intricate colored tabs and the printed bank logos sticking out from the pages. He saw the cold, calculated trap waiting for him. The dining room was completely silent. The trapdoor had finally swung open beneath their feet. They finally understood that they had not come here to bully a weak old man. They had marched 20 miles through the cold night just to deliver themselves directly to their own executioners. The silence in my dining room was absolute and suffocating. Stephanie and Bradley stood frozen near the entrance, unable to tear their eyes away from the teardrop emerald resting on the mahogany table. The arrogant facade they had worn for 4 years was entirely stripped away, leaving only raw panic. Jonathan Pierce did not give them a single moment to recover their composure. He leaned forward, resting his forearms against the polished wood. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the chilling, flat precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate a limb. He introduced himself as my retained legal counsel. He told them they were currently standing in my home entirely by my grace, and he commanded them to sit down in the empty chairs at the opposite end of the table. Bradley tried to resist. He tried to puff out his chest and maintain his illusion of authority. He opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer weight of the situation crushed the words before they could form. He looked at the jeweler sitting quietly to my left, and then he looked at the massive black binder sitting in the center of the table. He swallowed hard. His shoulders slumped forward in complete defeat. He grabbed the back of the wooden chair and pulled it out. He sat down heavily. Stephanie followed him, moving like a sleepwalker. She practically collapsed into the chair next to her husband. She kept her eyes glued to the green stone that had triggered this entire nightmare. Jonathan Pierce unclasped his thick leather portfolio. He reached out and placed his hand flat on the cover of the black binder Martha had compiled. He looked directly at Stephanie. He told her that my late wife had spent the final 12 months of her life meticulously auditing every single aspect of their financial existence. He told her Martha knew exactly what they were doing in the dark. Stephanie's face drained of all color. She shook her head side to side in a desperate attempt at denial. Jonathan did not care about her silent protests. He pushed the heavy black binder across the smooth mahogany surface. The heavy book slid perfectly, stopping exactly 1 inch away from Bradley's trembling hands. Jonathan instructed Bradley to open the cover. Bradley refused to touch it. He stared at the black leather as if it were a venomous snake. Jonathan sighed softly. He stood up from his chair and walked around the long table. He stood directly behind Bradley. He reached down and flipped the heavy cover open himself. He bypassed the introductory notes and turned directly to the section containing the bank records. The bright-colored tabs marked every single instance of their betrayal. Jonathan began reading the data aloud. His voice was steady and completely devoid of mercy. He detailed the exact dates and times of the unauthorized digital transfers. He read the amounts slowly. $3,000 on the 4th of May. $5,000 on the 12th of August. $2,000 the week before Thanksgiving. He explained exactly how Stephanie had used the personal information she gathered while helping me set up my computer to bypass my security protocols. He explained how she forged my digital signature to approve the transfers. Jonathan then flipped to the next page. He pointed to the credit card statements Martha had secured. He drew a perfect, undeniable line between the stolen money and their lavish lifestyle. He noted that the $3,000 stolen in May perfectly matched a transaction at a luxury boutique in Paris just 2 days later. He noted that the $5,000 stolen in August was used to make a massive payment on their heavily mortgaged house. He laid out the entire architecture of their embezzlement campaign. He told them they had systematically drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the retirement fund I built to protect my family. Stephanie suddenly slammed her hands on the table. She tried to interrupt Jonathan. She claimed the money was a series of early inheritance gifts. She claimed I had given her verbal permission to access the accounts because she was my only child. Her voice was shrill and desperate. She was lying right to my face even when the absolute proof was sitting directly in front of her. Jonathan leaned down so his face was entirely level with hers. He looked her right in the eyes and completely dismantled her lie. He told her that federal banking regulations did not care about her supposed verbal agreements. He told her forgery was a felony crime regardless of her blood relation to the victim. He stated that we had the exact digital footprints linking her computer network to the unauthorized access. He told her the evidence was absolute perfection and that she had committed textbook elder financial abuse. Stephanie closed her mouth. She sank back into her chair, completely paralyzed by the reality of her actions. Bradley tried to pivot the defense. He tried to shift the focus away from the stolen money and back to the physical property. He leaned away from Jonathan and looked directly at me. He told me that a few misunderstood bank transfers did not give me the right to destroy his front door. He told me he was still the legal owner of the massive gray stone house. He claimed I had committed a massive crime by locking him out of his own property and stealing all of his expensive belongings. He threatened to call the police right now and have me arrested for breaking and entering. Jonathan walked slowly back to his chair at the head of the table. He sat down and adjusted his expensive suit jacket. He smiled a cold, calculated smile. He told Bradley he was more than welcome to call the police. He even offered to let Bradley use my landline phone since his cellular service had been disconnected. Jonathan told Bradley the police would simply look at the court orders and laugh in his face. Jonathan reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out the legal documents I had signed that morning. He slid the notice of default and the ex parte motion for prejudgment attachment across the table. He placed them directly on top of the black binder. He told Bradley to read the signature of the commercial judge at the bottom of the page. He explained the mechanism of the trap they had triggered. Jonathan detailed how Bradley had secured the personal loans from me over the past 4 years. He explained that Bradley signed commercial agreements promising the funds were for a legitimate business generating verified monthly revenue. Jonathan tapped the binder and revealed that Martha had found his actual corporate tax filings. He told Bradley we knew his marketing firm had generated absolutely zero revenue for 3 years. He told Bradley he had committed commercial fraud to secure the loans. Jonathan watched the realization wash over Bradley's face. He explained that because the loans were acquired through intentional fraud, they were placed into immediate and total default. He told Bradley that when he signed those papers, he had used the equity in his massive house as collateral. Jonathan leaned forward and delivered the final crushing blow. He told Bradley the house no longer belonged to him. He stated that the commercial court had granted me absolute physical possession of the property to satisfy the defaulted debt. He told Bradley the locks were changed legally and the property was now entirely under my control. Bradley's face turned an ashen shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the court documents and saw the undeniable truth written in heavy black ink. The fortress he thought he owned was entirely gone. I looked at my daughter. She was crying silent tears. The vanity and arrogance were completely washed away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap brass key for the commercial storage unit. I placed it on the mahogany table right next to my wife's emerald necklace. I told Stephanie her massive house was completely empty. I told her every single piece of designer clothing and every piece of expensive furniture had been packed away by a moving crew. I told her I rented a cheap concrete storage unit on the edge of the city. I slid the brass key across the table until it stopped in front of her. I told her she had exactly 30 days to pay the rental fee on that unit. I told her if she failed to secure the funds, the storage facility would auction off every single thing she owned to the highest bidder. I told her she would be left with absolutely nothing but the dirty vacation clothes she was currently wearing. They were completely boxed in. Every single defense mechanism they possessed had been systematically destroyed. The ambush was perfectly executed, and they were left sitting in the ruins of their own greed. The initial shock that paralyzed Bradley began to slowly fade. It was replaced by a desperate, toxic survival instinct. I watched his jaw tighten as his mind scrambled to find a way out of the trap. He looked down at the cheap brass storage key sitting in front of his wife, and he let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It was an incredibly forced sound, completely devoid of any real humor. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back and stood up. He was attempting to use his physical height to reclaim the power dynamic he had just so rapidly lost. He placed his hands on his hips and glared down at Jonathan Pierce. He pointed a shaking finger at the lawyer and declared that this entire display was nothing but a cheap, theatrical bluff designed to scare them. Bradley admitted that the house was gone, but he claimed he absolutely did not care. He puffed out his chest and stated that the massive property was just a financial anchor anyway. He told me I had actually done him a massive favor by taking on the toxic debt and the severe maintenance costs. Bradley smiled a cruel, arrogant smile. He looked at Jonathan and bragged that civil courts were incredibly slow and largely incompetent. He proudly announced that he would simply walk into a federal courthouse tomorrow morning and file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. He said he would legally dissolve his failing marketing firm, wipe out all his outstanding debts, and walk away completely clean. He then turned his aggressive gaze directly toward me. He promised he would drag this civil dispute through the legal system for an entire decade. He swore he would make me spend every single remaining dollar of my retirement savings on exorbitant lawyer fees just to fight him over a house I could not afford to keep. He told me I was a foolish old man who had played his only card entirely too early. He genuinely believed that the loss of his home and the frozen bank accounts were the absolute worst things I could possibly do to him. He thought he could outsmart the system. He thought he could just wipe the slate clean and start another fraudulent life somewhere else using his silver tongue and his fake charm. Jonathan Pierce did not interrupt the arrogant speech. He sat perfectly still and let Bradley dig his own grave much deeper with every single word. The silence from my side of the table was completely terrifying. When Bradley finally finished his desperate rant, he was breathing heavily from the exertion. Jonathan slowly shook his head. He looked up at Bradley with an expression of pure, clinical pity. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but it carried the heavy weight of absolute doom. He told Bradley that bankruptcy was a protective shield designed strictly for honest businessmen who suffered from unfortunate economic downturns. He stated with absolute certainty that bankruptcy courts categorically refused to protect financial predators from federal prison. The cruel, forced smile instantly vanished from Bradley's face. Jonathan reached into his thick leather portfolio one final time. He bypassed the civil contracts and the property deeds. He reached deep into the back compartment and pulled out a thick stack of heavy white paper bound by a large black metal clip. The cover page did not have the standard heading of a commercial civil court. It bore the massive official seal of the Suffolk County District Attorney Office. Jonathan did not slide this document across the mahogany table. He held it up high in the air so the bright dining room chandelier illuminated the bold black text. He read the title of the document aloud. It was a formal drafted criminal complaint requesting immediate arrest warrants for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse. The atmosphere in the dining room instantly turned to pure ice. Stephanie let out a quiet whimpering sound and covered her face with both of her hands. Bradley took a massive step backward, bumping hard into the wall behind him. Jonathan lowered the document and placed the heavy criminal complaint directly on top of the black forensic binder. He proceeded to explain the brutal reality of their current situation. He told Bradley that systematically stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars using forged digital signatures crossed the line from a simple civil dispute directly into a major federal crime. He tapped his expensive silver pen against the binder and reminded them of the undeniable paper trail my brilliant wife had constructed. He explained that every single unauthorized bank transfer was tied directly to an IP address located inside their now foreclosed home. Every single forged document contained hidden digital metadata linking it directly to the personal computer sitting on Stephanie's desk. Jonathan told them the evidence was not just compelling or circumstantial. He called it an absolute prosecuting attorney dream case. He explained that elder financial abuse carried mandatory minimum prison sentences in the state of Massachusetts. He looked Bradley right in the eyes and calculated the terrifying math out loud. He estimated that based on the sheer volume of the stolen money and the long duration of the active fraud, they were both facing a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He detailed exactly what that meant for their future. He told them that felony fraud convictions meant they would never be allowed to hold corporate jobs again. Their passports would be permanently revoked. Any hidden assets they tried to secure would be seized by the government to pay mandatory criminal restitution. He painted a vivid picture of the public humiliation they would face when they were marched out of a courthouse in handcuffs, while the local news cameras recorded every second. Bradley's legs literally gave out beneath him. The last remaining pillar of his fake arrogance completely snapped under the unbearable weight of the truth. He slid down the painted wall and collapsed heavily into his wooden chair. He was no longer trying to intimidate anyone. He was trembling violently. The reality of a concrete prison cell completely shattered his fake billionaire persona. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, broken whisper. He begged me to tell him this was not real. He begged me to tell the lawyer to put the papers away. Stephanie was sobbing uncontrollably beside him. She reached across the wide mahogany table and tried to grab my hand. She cried out for her father. I pulled my arm back sharply, refusing to let her touch my skin. I looked at the two of them sitting in the absolute ruins of their own greed. They had absolutely nothing left in the world. Their stolen money was completely gone. Their massive house was permanently locked. Their luxury leased cars were repossessed. And now their physical freedom was resting entirely in the palm of my hand. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the hard wood. I looked directly into my daughter's tear-filled eyes. I reminded her of the exact words she had spoken to me in her marble foyer just a few days ago. I repeated her arrogant claim that I was a heavy burden who needed to be locked away in a medical facility. I asked her how it felt to know she was the one facing a locked steel cage. I turned my cold gaze to Bradley. I reminded him of the cruel laugh he let out when he told me to stop living in the past. I told him his entire future was now dictated by the decisions I was about to make. The power dynamic was completely and permanently inverted. They were no longer the confident predators circling a grieving old man. They were absolutely helpless victims of their own terrible choices. I told them Jonathan had already transmitted a secure digital copy of the forensic binder to a lead detective in the Financial Crimes Unit earlier this afternoon. I told them the police were fully briefed on the situation and were simply waiting for my final telephone call to officially execute the pending arrest warrants. I let that terrifying truth hang heavily in the quiet room. I wanted them to feel the exact same suffocating helplessness I had felt for the past 2 years. I watched them drown in the deep water of their own consequences. The denial was completely dead. The crush was absolute. They were finally ready to surrender everything to me. The crushing weight of the drafted criminal complaint sat in the center of the mahogany table like a live explosive. Bradley remained slumped in his chair. His eyes were completely vacant, staring blindly at the dark, polished wood. The arrogant marketing executive who had threatened to tie me up in civil court for an entire decade was entirely gone. He was replaced by a hollow shell of a man paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization of a federal prison sentence. He did not say another word. He did not move a single muscle. His surrender was completely silent and absolute. But Stephanie was different. She had always relied on emotional manipulation when her anger failed to produce results. I watched the frantic calculation happening behind her tear-filled eyes. She realized that pure aggression and entitled rage had only locked the trap tighter around their necks. She instantly pivoted to her oldest and most reliable defense mechanism. She tried to play the role of the innocent victim. Stephanie pushed her heavy wooden chair back and dropped directly onto her knees on my dining room floor. The loud thud echoed against the quiet walls. She crawled toward the head of the table where I was sitting. She grabbed the fabric of my trousers with her shaking hands. She looked up at me with dark makeup running down her pale cheeks. She began to weep loudly. It was a dramatic performance entirely designed to trigger the fatherly protective instinct I had always possessed. She sobbed uncontrollably, claiming that she was incredibly sorry. She swore she never meant to hurt me. She immediately blamed the entire embezzlement scheme on her husband. She claimed Bradley had pressured her into forging the digital signatures because his business was failing and he was threatening to leave her. She begged me to remember her childhood. She pleaded with me to look at her not as a criminal, but as the little girl I had raised in this very house. She told me she was simply overwhelmed by the massive stress of losing her mother. She actually had the absolute audacity to invoke Martha memory to save herself. She sobbed that her mother would never want to see her only child locked away in a federal penitentiary. She promised she would go to intensive therapy. She promised she would get a job and pay back every single stolen dollar, even if it took her the rest of her life. She begged me to withdraw the criminal complaint and give her one final chance to be a good daughter. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep emotional bond that usually connects a parent to a child had been entirely severed the exact moment she stole that teardrop emerald. I reached down and firmly detached her shaking hands from my clothing. I pushed my chair back slightly to create physical distance between us. I looked directly into her crying eyes, and I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I told her to stop using her dead mother as a human shield. I told her Martha was the one who built this entire trap because she knew exactly how entirely corrupt her own daughter had become. I told Stephanie that shedding desperate tears now did not erase 4 years of calculated daily betrayal. I reminded her of the absolute blinding arrogance she displayed in her marble foyer just a few days ago. I leaned forward and quoted her exact cruel words directly back into her face. I reminded her that she told me holding on to my wife's jewelry was pathetic. I reminded her that she said I was a heavy burden who needed to stop living in the past. I asked her why she was suddenly so desperate to cling to the past now that her fake billionaire future was completely destroyed. I threw her own callous justifications right back at her. I told her she said my grief was too depressing to deal with. I asked her if a federal prison sentence was going to be too depressing for her to handle. Stephanie recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. The fake sobbing instantly stopped. She realized the tears were completely ineffective against the cold logic I was using. I continued to systematically dismantle her pathetic defense. I reminded her of the cruel laugh she let out when Bradley suggested I sell my home and check myself into a retirement facility. I told her I found her current tears entirely unconvincing because I had already seen her true face when she thought she held all the power. I told her she was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for stealing my retirement money. She was only crying because she had finally been caught, and she was completely terrified of the brutal consequences. I told her the father she was begging for mercy died the exact moment she chose to fund her luxury vacation with the sacred heirloom of the woman who gave her life. I told her she was no longer my daughter. She was simply a massive financial liability that I was currently liquidating. The cold, absolute finality in my voice completely shattered her remaining hopes. She realized I was not going to be emotionally blackmailed. I was not going to negotiate based on a shared family history she had already completely destroyed. Stephanie slowly pushed herself off the hard floor. Her knees were trembling so violently she had to hold on to the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. She looked at Jonathan Pierce, and then she looked at Richard Caldwell. Neither man offered her a single shred of sympathy. They looked at her with the exact same cold indifference I felt in my own heart. She finally understood that there was absolutely no escape from this room. The surrender was complete. They had absolutely no leverage left to pull. They were completely broken, stripped of their arrogance, their stolen wealth, and their dignity. I turned my attention to my lawyer and nodded my head, indicating that it was time to present the final binding terms of their destruction. I turned my attention to Jonathan Pierce and gave him a single sharp nod. He understood the silent command immediately. He reached into his leather portfolio for the absolute last time tonight. He pulled out a thin stack of legal documents printed on heavy white paper. These pages did not bear the seal of a criminal court. They were strictly civil contracts, but they carried the exact same devastating weight. Jonathan placed the contract squarely on the mahogany table right next to the drafted criminal complaint. He produced 2 heavy silver fountain pens and set one in front of Bradley and one in front of Stephanie. The room remained incredibly quiet. I looked at the 2 broken people sitting across from me and laid out the absolute final terms of their existence. I told them I was holding their entire future in the palm of my hand. The drafted criminal complaint sitting on the table represented 10 years in a federal penitentiary. It represented the complete public destruction of their lives and the absolute loss of their freedom. I told them I had the power to send that document to the district attorney with a single phone call, but I offered them one single narrow path to avoid a concrete cell. I pointed to the civil contract Jonathan had just placed on the table. I explained exactly what it demanded. I told them that if they signed those pages, they were legally acknowledging the absolute forfeiture of their massive house. They were confessing to the defaulted business loans and admitting they had absolutely zero claim to the property. They were also signing a permanent, irrevocable waiver of inheritance. I told Stephanie she was legally stripping herself of her title as my daughter. She would never receive another single dollar from my estate. She would never inherit my home or my savings or my wife's jewelry. The document legally severed every single financial and familial tie between us forever. But the terms went even further. I told them they were agreeing to a strict, permanent restraining order. They were never allowed to contact me again. They were never allowed to set foot on my property or approach me in public. They were barred from ever speaking my name or Martha name in any legal or public forum. If they attempted to sue me or retaliate in any way, the contract stipulated that the criminal complaint for wire fraud would be automatically transmitted to the authorities without a single warning. I was offering them their physical freedom in exchange for their absolute complete banishment from my life. They were trading their arrogant existence for a life of quiet, absolute poverty. I leaned back in my heavy wooden chair and gave them exactly 1 minute to decide. I told them they could either sign the paper and walk out the front door right now with absolutely nothing but the suitcases they brought back from Hawaii, or they could refuse to sign, and Jonathan would call the police to execute the felony arrest warrants before they even reached the end of my driveway. The choice was entirely theirs, but the outcome was already permanently written. I watched them stare at the heavy white paper, realizing the absolute totality of their defeat. Bradley did not even bother reading the intricate legal jargon on the pages. He was completely broken by the sheer terror of federal prison. The confident marketing executive who manipulated my finances for years was entirely gone. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely pick up the silver fountain pen. He fumbled with the heavy metal barrel, dropping it once onto the table before securing a grip. He pulled the document closer to him and hastily scribbled his signature on the bottom line. His handwriting was a frantic, illegible mess compared to the confident, arrogant signatures he had used to forge my name and steal my money. He pushed the paper toward Stephanie and dropped the pen back onto the table. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the wood. He had surrendered everything in less than 10 seconds just to save his own skin. Stephanie stared down at the dotted line, waiting for her signature. She picked up the second silver pen. Her fingers gripped it so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. She looked up at me one final time. She was searching my face for any lingering trace of the loving father she had manipulated for her entire life. She was looking for a single ounce of hesitation or regret or familial warmth. I gave her absolutely nothing. My expression remained completely flat and impenetrable. I looked at her with the exact same cold calculation she had used when she sold her dead mother emerald necklace to fund her tropical vacation. I was no longer her safety net. I was the architect of her permanent exile. She looked down at the paper. A single tear fell from her cheek and landed on the heavy white stalk, smudging the black ink slightly. She pressed the nib of the fountain pen to the paper and signed her full name. The sound of the metal scratching against the paper was the sound of the final lock clicking shut. She had officially signed away her entire future. She had legally admitted her guilt and forfeited every single thing she had ever stolen from me. The illusion of her wealthy, perfect life was officially dead, and she had just signed the death certificate herself. Jonathan Pierce reached across the wide mahogany table and calmly retrieved the signed contracts. He checked the signatures to ensure they were legally binding. He nodded his head once to confirm the execution was flawless. He gathered the drafted criminal complaint, the forensic audit binder, and the signed contracts, and placed them all carefully back into his thick leather portfolio. The legal trap was completely secured. The weapons were packed away. The absolute power I had reclaimed was now permanently crystallized in those documents. I looked at the two empty people sitting at the far end of my table. They had nothing left to say. They had no more lies to spin and no more arrogance to project. They were completely hollowed out by their own greed. I stood up from my chair. I picked up the black velvet pouch containing my wife's teardrop emerald necklace and slipped it safely into my breast pocket. I looked down the length of the dining room table and delivered my final command. I told them the transaction was officially complete. I told them to take their luggage and get out of my house. The command hung in the silent air of the dining room. I told them to take their luggage and get out of my house. Bradley was the first to move. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and pushed himself upward. His joints popped loudly in the quiet room. He looked like an old man. The youthful, arrogant energy he used to intimidate people was entirely drained from his body. He did not look at Jonathan Pierce. He did not look at Richard Caldwell. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood floor. He turned around and began the slow, heavy walk back toward the front foyer. He moved with a pronounced limp. The miles he had walked in expensive leather loafers had blistered his feet. I watched his tailored vacation shirt hang loosely over his slumped shoulders. He was a completely broken structure. The foundation of his lies had crumbled, and the entire building had collapsed directly on top of him. Stephanie remained in her chair for a few moments longer. She stared at the black velvet pouch secured safely inside my breast pocket. She was mourning the loss of the teardrop emerald not because it belonged to her mother, but because it represented the last piece of wealth she could have stolen. She slowly pushed herself away from the table. She did not bother to wipe the dried tears streaking her ruined makeup. She turned and followed her husband out of the dining room. Her expensive designer heels dragged heavily against the hardwood floor. There was no more clicking of confident footsteps. There was only the sound of total defeat. I stood up from the head of the table. I followed them into the hallway to ensure they actually left my property. Jonathan and Richard remained seated in the dining room, respecting the deeply personal nature of this final eviction. I watched Bradley and Stephanie reach the front foyer. Their heavy, hard-shell suitcases were sitting exactly where they had abandoned them earlier tonight. Bradley reached down and grabbed the plastic handle of his large black suitcase. He lacked the physical strength to lift it. He simply tilted it backward onto its wheels. Stephanie picked up her designer beach bag and grabbed the handle of her own matching luggage. They stood facing the heavy solid wood of my front door. Neither of them made a move to open it. The reality of what was waiting for them on the other side of that door was completely terrifying. When they walked into my house an hour ago, they believed they were victims of a temporary massive inconvenience. They believed a loud argument would fix their bank accounts and unlock their front door. Now they understood that the cold, dark night outside was their permanent new reality. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They could not call a taxi. They could not book a hotel room. They could not even buy a warm cup of coffee to fight the freezing wind. Every single dollar they possessed was locked behind a federal court order. I stood 5 feet behind them. I did not offer them a jacket. I did not offer them a glass of water for the road. I simply waited for them to cross the threshold. Bradley finally reached out and turned the heavy brass knob. He pulled the door open. A harsh gust of freezing midnight wind swept directly into the warm foyer. Stephanie shivered violently. She wrapped her thin arms tightly around her chest, trying to preserve whatever body heat she had left. Bradley stepped out onto the porch. The plastic wheels of his suitcase clattered loudly against the stone threshold. He dragged the heavy weight behind him. Stephanie hesitated. She stood with one foot inside my warm house and one foot on the cold stone porch. She turned her head slightly, looking over her shoulder. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the weak, grieving father to suddenly intervene. She expected me to tell her it was too cold outside and that she could sleep on the couch just for tonight. She expected a tiny sliver of mercy she could exploit tomorrow morning. I kept my face completely rigid. I looked directly into her eyes, and I gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the open door. I was telling her the transaction was final, and there was absolutely zero grace period. She turned her head away from me. She stepped completely out of the house. She pulled her suitcase over the threshold. The plastic wheels hit the concrete porch with a sharp, loud crack. I walked forward and grabbed the edge of the thick wooden door. I looked at the two of them standing in the dark. They were nothing more than shadows, dragging heavy burdens. I did not say goodbye. I pushed the door forward. The heavy wood swung shut, and the latch clicked firmly into place. I turned the brass deadbolt, locking them out of my life forever. I stood perfectly still in the warm, quiet foyer. I could hear the faint sound of their suitcase wheels rolling down the long concrete driveway. The sound grew quieter and quieter until it completely faded into the ambient noise of the night. I walked into my living room and approached the large front window. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. The street lamps cast long yellow beams across the dark pavement. I watched Bradley and Stephanie walking down the center of the empty suburban road. They were walking aimlessly into the darkness, carrying the heavy bags of a luxury vacation they could never actually afford. The absolute consequence of their greed had finally materialized. They had traded their family, their dignity, and their future for a few years of fake wealth. Now the debt was fully collected. I watched them turn the corner at the end of the street. They disappeared from my sight completely. The parasitic weight that had been crushing my life for the past 4 years was entirely gone. Jonathan Pierce and Richard Caldwell left my house shortly after the front door closed on my former family. I thanked both of them for their absolute professionalism and their unwavering dedication to my wife and her final wishes. Jonathan shook my hand warmly and promised to call me on Monday morning to finalize the property deeds and confirm the storage unit transfer. Richard gave me a quiet, respectful nod and told me it was an incredible honor to witness such a flawless execution of justice. When their cars finally pulled out of my driveway and disappeared down the dark street, I was completely alone. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt on my front door for the last time that night. I leaned my back against the solid wood and took a deep, long breath. For the past 2 years, the silence in this large house had felt incredibly heavy. It used to press down on my shoulders like a physical weight, constantly reminding me of the woman I had lost. But tonight, the silence felt entirely different. It felt incredibly light. It felt clean. The toxic energy that Stephanie and Bradley constantly brought into my home was permanently eradicated. The air was no longer thick with their entitlement and their endless demands for my hard-earned money. My home was finally a sanctuary again. I walked slowly down the long hallway, letting my footsteps echo naturally against the hardwood floors. I did not feel the bone-deep exhaustion I had expected to feel after such a massive emotional confrontation. Instead, I felt a profound sense of rejuvenation rushing through my veins. I walked into my ground floor study. The room was exactly as I had left it earlier today. The framed map of the city was still slid to the side, exposing the heavy steel door of my wall safe. I walked over to the safe and pushed the heavy metal door shut. I spun the brass dial, aggressively scrambling the combination. I realized I did not need to hide my valuables from my own flesh and blood anymore. The parasites had been completely removed from the host. I walked over to the small wooden cabinet in the corner of the study and opened the glass door. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with my absolute favorite aged bourbon. I poured a generous amount of the amber liquid into a heavy glass tumbler. I carried the glass into the main living room. The room was dark except for the soft yellow glow of a single reading lamp resting on a small wooden table in the corner. Next to the lamp sat a large silver-framed photograph of Martha. It was a picture I had taken on our 30th wedding anniversary. She was smiling brightly, wearing the teardrop emerald necklace resting perfectly against her collarbone. I set the glass of bourbon down on the wooden table right next to her photograph. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the small black velvet pouch. I opened the drawstrings and tipped the pouch downward. The heavy gold chain and the flawless green stone slid smoothly into the palm of my hand. I held it directly under the warm light of the reading lamp. I thought about the microscopic hidden compartment resting silently behind the solid gold backing. I thought about the sheer brilliance of the woman who had transformed a simple piece of antique jewelry into a devastating weapon of justice. She had anticipated every single move her greedy daughter would make, and she had engineered the absolute perfect defense mechanism to protect me. I carefully lifted the gold chain with both of my hands. I draped the necklace over the top corner of the heavy silver frame. The teardrop emerald dangled perfectly next to Martha's smiling face in the photograph. The stone caught the yellow light and shimmered with a deep, rich, beautiful green color. I stood there looking at the woman I loved more than anything in the world. I did not feel the sharp, stabbing pain of grief anymore. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. We had fought a silent war against the very people we raised, and we had won a decisive and absolute victory. I picked up the heavy glass tumbler from the table. I raised the bourbon toward the silver-framed photograph. I spoke aloud to the empty quiet room. I told Martha that her master plan was a complete success. I told her the house was completely safe and the financial accounts were entirely secured. I promised her that nobody would ever disrespect her memory or steal the resources we worked our entire lives to build. I took a slow sip of the warm amber liquid. It burned pleasantly against the back of my throat, warming my chest. The heavy emotional burden I had carried for years was permanently lifted. The anger and the profound betrayal were completely washed away, leaving only pure, unadulterated peace. I knew the coming days would involve signing complex legal paperwork and finalizing the absolute severing of my estate. I knew Stephanie and Bradley would spend the next decade facing the brutal reality of the federal justice system, but absolutely none of that mattered to me tonight. Their future was entirely their own problem now. My future was completely secure and entirely my own. I sat down in my comfortable leather armchair, resting right next to the photograph of my brilliant wife. I closed my eyes and listened to the gentle sound of the wind blowing against the solid glass windows of my fortress. I was William Harding. I was a retired civil engineer. I was a proud, loyal husband. And for the first time in a very long time, I was completely and truly free. I have learned that blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your respect or your hard-earned resources. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual gratitude and unwavering loyalty, rather than selfish entitlement and deceit. When you spend your entire life sacrificing for people who view you only as a financial stepping stone, you are not helping them grow. You are simply funding your own eventual destruction. Sometimes the absolute greatest act of love you can perform is allowing greedy people to completely face the devastating consequences of their own actions. True peace only arrives when you finally find the courage to permanently lock the door on those who only sought to exploit your generous heart. If you believe that toxic family members should always face the absolute consequences of their greed, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of undeniable justice.